Parmenides is unique in the history of philosophy in that his answer consists of a single word. That may have been because his problem, the ontological problem, is a simple problem. As Quine says, it can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? And yet others have not found it so easy. The Milesians assembled a conceptual toolkit selected to be able to say as much as possible about what there is in as economical a way as possible. We are still working away with the same tools. Heraclitus turned inwards from the enumeration of the things that are to the contemplation of that ephemeral structure of all that we can only glimpse through images, the lyre, the river, fire. Parmenides' route is different, though as solitary as Heraclitus and as arduous as that of the Milesians. It is to judge by reason, as the goddess tells him after warning him against an aimless eye or ear. Crinae logo. The phrase has the force of a motto. Surely we all regularly make use of reason in our day-to-day lives. Surely the Milesians, even Heraclitus at times, employed logos. Parmenides' procedure is much more extreme. The logos is not to be used to sort the evidence that we have, nor is it to be the logical backbone of a universe whose human face we have independently glimpsed. For Parmenides, the logos is the only tool we have. And there is stern work ahead, for we must build up the universe from basic principles. That is why to take the step of being guided by reason alone is like stepping into the dark. The seen world vanishes. It is a kind of catabasis, and that is how Parmenides describes it, as the journey through the gates of the paths of night and day to the halls of night. There the goddess greets him. It is like what is said to that other questor, Hans Castorp, in the X-ray room. To be able to see, you must first wash your eyes in the darkness. Parmenides' single word is an affirmation. It is the pillar left standing in the logical structure of things when the faulty beams have been tried and have collapsed. And it is erected on no fundament. Even in a vacuum, there are 3 choices. That, 1, it is, and it is impossible for it not to be. Hemen hopos estin te kai hos uk estin me enai. 2, it is not, and it is necessary that it not be. Hed hos uk estin te kai hos chreon estin me enai. Or 3, to be and not to be are the same, and not the same. To pelein te kai uk enai tauton ku tauton. A first point to make is that there is not only one word in either 1 or 2, nor is there only one proposition. Instead of 1 P, 2 not P, we get 1 P and necessarily P, 2 not P and necessarily not P. Why bother with this? Is it because Parmenides has confused the necessary truth of a tautology, necessarily if P, then P, with the necessary truth of a true proposition? P, if P, then necessarily P. Perhaps not. Parmenides probably did not believe that the statement, Parmenides' mother is dead, if true, is necessarily true. But did he believe that the statement is, if true, is necessarily true? In any case, there is a hint that the point may have been more practical. The hint is the phrasing of 1. Parmenides could have written, it is and must be, but instead he has gone for, it is and it is impossible for it not to be. Perhaps this is simply another instance of Parmenides' liking for clear-cut distinctions. He is trying to make clear that 1 and 2 are absolutely mutually exclusive, and thus showing up the absurdity of 3. Houtos e pampan pelenai kleon esti e uchi. A second point is more important. Granted that Parmenides has boldly presented the only 3 possible ways of inquiry, it is not, or it is both. But what is? That is, what is the subject of esti? Well, how about ta eon, or something like that? This is clearly what is being discussed, and clearly a perfect answer to the question, what is there? But like Quine's initial answer, everything, it is less than illuminating, tautologous. And besides, Parmenides is aiming to prove that it is, so he cannot just assume it from the start in a phrase like ta eon. Nor would something like the one or the one being do. In fact, that would be worse. The first suggestion, ta eon, ta on, assumed that which Parmenides would go on to prove 1 step later. The present offering assumes what Parmenides will go on to prove 2 steps later. For it is only in fragment 8 that he is able to state that it is a single continuous mass, oude dialecton estin epe pan estin homoion, and there on the basis of what he has earlier proven, that it is. And we can also rule out the chance that there is no subject. Esti cannot be impersonal as, say, it's raining is impersonal, because Parmenides goes on to supply a few characteristics to his subject. Among those characteristics are spatial and temporal continuity. But no one has ever said of the it in it's raining that it is spatially or temporally continuous. In fact, very little has been said about that it. From that is, it sometimes rains. Or apart from that, it sometimes rains. So what do we know about the subject of esti? We know that it exists because we are talking and thinking about it, and what exists is said in fragment 2 to be what can be talked or thought about. The subject, that is anything and everything. What esti is x, a variable which designates whatever you want it to. A third problem is open to those who are too philosophically trained. It is to ask whether Parmenides uses the verb enai in the existential or the predicative sense. Does it mean there exists something? Or something is something or somehow? Well, if something is somehow, then it exists. And if something exists, it is somehow. But many have followed Mill, John Stewart, in following Mill, James, in making a clear distinction between them. It is a distinction we rarely make in English, and it is even less there in Greek, even among the philosophically minded. 2 examples will be enough. First, when Aristotle discusses the 4 senses of to be in Greek, there is a per accidens, per se, veridical, and a potential use, but no unsullied existential. And second, and closer to Parmenides, think of the celebrated opening sentence of Protagoras' work on truth. Man is the measure of all things, of what is, that it is, of what is not, that it is not. Ton men on ton hos estin, ton de uk on ton hos uk estin. We would like to count this absolute appearance of the verb as existential, but Protagoras is clearly fronting his book on truth with a claim that man is a criterion for knowledge about all things, that is, all matters of fact and falsehood, not only about questions of the form, what is there? Even Plato takes the verb in a predicative sense. When he quotes the phrase in the Theaetetus, he explains by saying, "As each thing seems to me, such is it for me, and as it seems to you, such is it for you." And he illustrates this by the example of a wind being cold for one man, but not for another. The Greeks, like us I suspect, thought of man being the measure of the existence or non-existence of things in the same way as they thought of him being the measure of the wind being cold or not. And this is how Parmenides uses esti. There is no confusion, and only a fusion if you prefer to think of two concepts as separated, which are usually found together. And while we are on the subject, it is worth mentioning two other features of the Greek verb enai. The first is the durative aspect, the fact that the Greek verb, like the Indo-European s, but unlike many modern European languages, has no aorist and no perfect. Its only aspect is continuous, durative. The medieval and modern concept of existence is instead founded on a perfect, and existence takes its meaning from the perfect use of the verb in the phrase what has emerged, id quod extitit. So Parmenides' esti is much more stable than our own precarious is. The second feature of enai worth noticing here may be called the locative value. In most other languages, an existential use of the verb to be will be accompanied by a locative expression, as in our there is, or in the French il y a, or the Italian c'è. The Greek verb had this sense of its own accord. As Plato says in the Timaeus, we say that it's necessary for everything which is real to be somewhere in some place and to occupy some space. This should be kept in mind when Parmenides seems to be moving, in what may be for us a slightly surprising way, from existential first principles to giving extension to his concept of being. We have asked enough questions of esti. Now, it should ask questions of us, or more strongly, it should refute some of our answers. For such a dialectical role is what Parmenides claims for his thought. It is a polyderous elenchus, a hard-hitting elenchus. What does elenchus imply? Two things. The first is a context of argument or dialogue. As Socrates so nimbly used it, the elenchus was the technique of leading an opponent and partner in dialogue from mundanely acceptable premises to howlingly unacceptable conclusions. Unacceptable, of course, to the bemused victim and patient. So the second connotation of elenchus is refutation, often with overtones of shame carried over from its original use in Pindar and others to suggest someone letting himself down in defeat. What we expect then is a dialogue between the poem and the reader, and a pretty rigorous one. But we can dramatize that process by listening to a discussion between the hypothetical philosopher Professor X, a thinker greatly influenced by the Betathon of Firth's article, and Parmenides. Our Latvian lover of wisdom is working away at the question, what is there with Parmenides? He starts off with what he thinks is a simple contrast. There are horses, he says, and Parmenides furrows his brow but remains silent. But there are no unicorns. Parmenides immediately objects, for you could not know what is not, that cannot be done, nor say it. U tegar an gnoies torge me eon u gar anuston u te flasais. He seems to have a point here. If you can talk about a unicorn, it must in some sense exist, otherwise it would have nothing to talk about. And note that there is no halfway existence here, no unactualized possibles or Menongian substances. Houtos e pan pelenai chreon esti e uchi. Mr. X is somewhat taken aback at this response, but he is quick on the uptake. He realizes that all statements of the form not P have been ruled out by Parmenides. And so he continues good-naturedly to answer the question, what is there? By statements of the form P. Dogs are, he says. Cats are. But it is not long before Parmenides stops him again. You are saying the right thing, says the Greek, but in a bizarre way. You are saying the same thing again and again in different words. Professor X disagrees. I'm using different words because I'm referring to different things, says X. Different things, says Parmenides, slightly scandalized. X decides to be patient. Different things. Here, for example, is a cat, and it is not a dog. But he knows he has put his foot in it. Ute gar an gnoies toge me eon ute frasais, comes the inevitable reply, and we are back where we started. Sunon de moi estin hopothen arxomai tothi gar palin ixomai autis. So Parmenides' hard-hitting elenchus works always to beat us back to the one sure thing, esti. It is early Greek philosophy's Archimedean point. Now those who know Parmenides will be slightly troubled. He denies you the use of the concepts of nothing and plurality, but he himself uses them all the time. Parmenides argues that any denial of existence is nonsense. The non-existent cannot be thought or spoken of. Denials of existence are not sayable or thinkable, according to him. And yet Parmenides sometimes expresses this very point in an apparently contradictory fashion. There is no such thing as what is not, he claims. There is nothing except what there is. The fact that non-existence makes no sense leads him into a conundrum. It leads him to say that some things, such as non-existence and variety, do not exist. But he has just shown that such a state is incoherent or impossible. And this is a criticism that Plato anticipated in his Sophist. Actually, this is no sloppiness on Parmenides' part. The problem is inherent in language. Language is developed through usage. And we often, however falsely and foolishly, say that things are not. Therefore, it becomes impossible to say that non-existence is impossible, meaning, of course, not possible, without contradiction. As with the modern-day political revolutionary who finds it impossible not to be capitalist and remain alive, so with the ancient philosophical revolutionary. The system is set against them. But both hope that, once you understand what they have been saying, the system will dissolve or collapse. Language cannot really collapse, but it may be transcended or fled, the eyes cleansed of the riddling light. But assent is the more familiar image. My propositions are elucidatory in this way, says Wittgenstein. He who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless when he has climbed out through them, over them, on them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. Parmenides' propositions are similarly signs on the way to a vantage point from which their apparent contradictoriness will fade into invisibility. If this essay is taking on a kind of religious extremism, that is not my fault, for Parmenides' elenchus is hard-hitting indeed. Socrates' elenchus often felt like a slap in the face, forcing a man to re-examine his moral or political conceptions. Parmenides' elenchus does more than that. It passes from the Socratic gadfly through the Wittgensteinian boxing match, all the way to the Nietzschean conception of philosophizing with a hammer. After Parmenides is finished with you, all you will be able to say is esti. Now this may be true, but you cannot live by repeating that one statement. And so we will see next time how Parmenides took some steps from esti to re-establishing some kind of universe. He also seems to have recognized the need to set up some theory that mortals could live with besides the harsh, all-seeing gaze of his elenchus. The result would not be the truth, but it would be dokimos, dependable. The word may well mean something quite strong, such as steadfast or sure, as Owen says. And this is how the goddess sees the way of opinion. The mistake is to assume that the truth is steadfast. Granted, it is once described as atremes, unshakable. but that, like polydeios, is a harsher term than dokimos. The truth is a hostile element that must be faced, like a katabasis, a journey into the domata nuktos, the houses of the night. The way of opinion is our usual climate, the deceptive but necessary light. And thus the image of the journey itself underlines the fact that we are meant to take Parmenides' statements as pure, arcane, profoundly true, but perhaps impracticable. This is, after all, a poem, and it is a religious poem, and it sets up its own holy blazon, an alternative tetragrammaton. We are fools tapping along with twisted but trusty canes. We may have doubts about the true path, doubts about what is there and what there is. But from the goddess of truth, there comes a strong medicine, a single, unshakable affirmation.